Dharma Bites is brought to you by Free Buddhist Audio, the Dharma for your life. Our work is funded entirely by donations from our generous listeners. If you would like to help us keep this free, make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. Thank you, and happy listening.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about David Lloyd and Bhikkhu Bodhi. I'm going to start with David Lloyd. Right, he's quite unusual because he's a practicing Buddhist and he's also an academic. There are a few of these around, actual academics who write about Buddhism as academics, but are also practicing Buddhists. He's been a Zen practitioner since 1971, and he's a qualified Zen teacher. And he spent quite a bit of his adult life living in the East. He lived for 6 years in Singapore and 15 years in Japan. I think that's something that's common between Bhante and Bhikkhu Bodhi and David Lloyd, is that they all have spent significant periods of time in the East as well as in the West. So my first contact with David Lloyd was reading a book called A Buddhist History of the West. And this is a book that examines how greed, hatred, and delusion have conditioned the history of the West. So he's written a history of the West using, if you like, a Buddhist lens to examine and talk about that history. And it really excited me, the book. I really liked it because I liked the grand scale and the perspective of the project. You know, what a magnificent idea to look at the history of the West, key events in the West, from a Buddhist perspective. And it reminded me of something of what I felt when I got involved in Triratna and got connected with Triratna. One of the main reasons for that was because Sangharakshita talks about the axial age, that period from 800 to 200 BCE, when there were all these new thinkers arising, including the Buddha. He talked about evolution. He had a grand view of history and time. And that excites me. And something about David Lloyd's book, A Buddhist History of the West, excited me in the same way. What's central to that book is his notion of what he calls lack. L-A-C-K, his notion of lack. So I want to try and just unpick that, what this notion is. So Buddhism teaches us that there is no fixed and separate self. There's no fixed and separate self. Our sense of self, if you like, is constructed. It's an ever-changing process. There's no fixed, unchanging, separate essence to it. It's an ever-changing process. The self does not exist separately, does not exist in its own right. And because of the absence of a separate reality of its own, because of the absence of any fixed or permanent or stable ground, then the self, David Lloyd argues, is haunted at some level by a sense of lack, that something is missing. That fact that we don't have any stable or permanent ground, at some level we know that we are haunted by a sense of lack, or lack short. But because of our inability to recognize and accept fully that the self is empty of a separate and fixed existence, we close up and experience a deep-rooted level of unease or unsatisfactoriness or suffering, which we can never quite resolve. So that we have this sense of lack. There's a sense that something is missing. We close up and don't quite engage with it. And the result is that there, at a deep level, there is, if you like, an existential level of suffering, of unsatisfactoriness, of unease. And one of the ways that we use to try to cover up this sense of lack, to cover up the fact that the sense that the self has no fixed or permanent separate existence, one of the ways that we use to cover that up is consumerism. And consumerism promises but never can ultimately deliver fulfillment. We are deceived into seeking an answer to this sense of lack through consumerism. We are fooled into going down that path. So we try to build a sense of identity by consuming. And as David Lloyd says, if instead we were to explore this lack of a separate fixed existence and even to embrace it, we would in fact discover a tremendous source of creativity and positivity. We may be scared and put off the idea of exploring it, but in fact, if we were to embrace the reality that there is no separate fixed self existence, we would discover a tremendous source of creativity and positivity. But we're fooled. So this sense of lack, this lack is what is right the way through the book, The Buddhist History of the West. And it's a central part of his take of what is wrong with our lives and with our society.
We hope you enjoyed today's Dharma Bite. Please help us keep this free. Make a contribution at freebuddhistaudio.com/donate. And thank you.